In a quiet suburb of Chicago, Illinois, the Anderson family was preparing to celebrate a significant event, the golden wedding anniversary of George and Martha Anderson. 50 years of marriage were meant to be a joyful family celebration. No one could have predicted that this evening would turn into a tragedy that would shock not only the family but the entire local community. What seemed like an ordinary family gathering turned into a crime scene, where not only loving relatives were seated at the table, but also hidden grudges, concealed motives, and deadly intentions. The Anderson family was well known in Glenview, a respectable suburb of Chicago. George Anderson, a former successful lawyer, and his wife Martha, a former schoolteacher, raised 3 children and were considered a model of family well-being. Their eldest son, Michael, followed in his father's footsteps and became a partner in a large law firm. The middle daughter, Elizabeth, chose a career in medicine and worked at a prestigious private clinic. The youngest son, Richard, did not live up to his parents' expectations. He frequently changed jobs and struggled with a gambling problem. The preparation for the golden wedding anniversary began several months before the significant date. Elizabeth took on most of the organizational tasks, striving to make this day special for her parents. She booked a cozy restaurant, La Stella d'Oro, known for its exquisite Italian cuisine and elegant atmosphere. Michael handled the financial aspects, paying for the venue and catering services. Despite his issues, Richard volunteered to help with decorating the hall and organizing the music. A week before the celebration, a festive bustle reigned in the Anderson household. Despite her advanced age, Martha personally worked with the restaurant's chef to plan the menu. She insisted that the menu include traditional family dishes, including her grandmother's signature apple pie. George, usually reserved in showing emotions, could not hide his excitement and joy. He spent hours in his study, working on the speech he planned to deliver to the guests. The evening of the celebration arrived on September 15, 2023. Guests began arriving at La Stella d'Oro around 7 p.m. Among the invitees were not only family members but also George and Martha's longtime friends, former colleagues, and neighbors. About 50 people were expected in total. Elizabeth greeted the guests at the entrance, looking elegant in a dark blue evening gown. Michael, impeccably dressed in an expensive suit as always, helped seat the guests at the tables. Richard, noticeably nervous, bustled around the bar, occasionally glancing at the entrance. George and Martha appeared at the restaurant at 7:30 p.m., greeted by applause from the guests. Martha looked charming in a cream dress she had chosen specifically for the occasion. Around her neck was a pearl necklace, a gift from George on their 25th wedding anniversary. George, in a classic black tuxedo, proudly and tenderly escorted his wife by the arm. The beginning of the evening unfolded in a warm, almost familial atmosphere. Guests chatted, shared memories of George and Martha, and looked at the photos displayed on the walls. Waiters moved between the tables, serving drinks and appetizers. No one could have imagined that behind this facade of family happiness lay secrets and grudges that would soon come to light in the most tragic way. At 8:30 p.m., Michael called for silence to begin the evening's formal part. He gave a brief but emotional speech congratulating his parents on their golden anniversary. Then George took the floor. Standing with a glass of champagne in his hand, he began to speak about the years spent with Martha, their love, the challenges they had overcome together, and the joy their children and grandchildren had brought them. None of those present could have foreseen that this solemn moment would mark the beginning of a chain of events that would forever change the lives of the Anderson family and reveal the dark secrets hidden behind the facade of an ideal family life. George Anderson stood before the gathered guests, holding a glass of champagne in his hand. His speech was filled with warmth and gratitude toward his wife, children, and the life they had lived together. The guests listened attentively, many wiping away tears, touched by the sincerity of his words. Martha sat beside him, gazing at her husband with love. "For these 50 years, Martha and I have been through a lot," George said. "There have been ups and downs, joys and sorrows. But every day, I thanked fate for giving me such a wonderful life partner." He turned to his wife and raised his glass. "To you, my dear Martha, to our family, to 50 years of love." All the guests stood up, raising their glasses. The sound of clinking crystal filled the room as George took a sip of champagne. However, within seconds, his expression changed. He put the glass down and grabbed his throat, clearly in great discomfort. "George? What's wrong?" Martha asked, alarmed by her husband's strange behavior. George couldn't answer. His face turned pale, his breathing became labored. He tried to take a step but stumbled and fell to the floor. Panic erupted in the room. "Dad!" Elizabeth shouted, rushing to her father's side. As a doctor, she was the first to realize the seriousness of the situation. "Someone, call an ambulance." Michael was already on his phone, dialing 911, while Richard stood frozen, unable to move in shock. Elizabeth tried to provide first aid to her father, but George's condition was rapidly deteriorating. His body convulsed, and foam began to appear at his mouth. Martha, gripped by horror, held her husband's hand, begging him to hold on. "What is happening? What's wrong with him?" she cried, looking at her daughter. "It looks like poisoning," Elizabeth replied, trying to stay calm, but the worry in her voice was evident. "He needs to be taken to the hospital as soon as possible." The guests watched in shock. Some tried to help while others moved aside to give more space. The festive atmosphere instantly shifted to one of tragedy. After what felt like an eternity, the sound of sirens filled the air. Paramedics rushed into the restaurant, clearing a path through the crowd. They quickly assessed George's condition and began administering emergency care. "He's suffering from severe intoxication," one of the paramedics said. "We need to get him to the hospital immediately." As George was being prepared for transport, Detective Robert Harris, who happened to be among the guests as a longtime family friend, began inspecting the scene. His attention was drawn to the glass from which George had drunk. A small amount of liquid remained at the bottom. "Nobody touch that glass," he commanded, "and no one is to leave until the police arrive." Martha, still in shock, tried to go with her husband to the hospital, but Elizabeth stopped her. "Mom, I'll go with Dad. You need to stay here and calm down. Michael will take care of you." Michael nodded, placing a comforting arm around his mother's shoulders. Richard finally snapped out of his daze and approached the family. What happens now?" he asked in a trembling voice. "The main thing now is to save Dad," Michael replied. "After that, we'll figure everything out." As the paramedics took George away, with Elizabeth following them, the atmosphere in the restaurant was filled with fear and uncertainty. Guests whispered among themselves, trying to make sense of what had happened. Detective Harris had already begun preliminary questioning of witnesses, awaiting the arrival of the main investigative team. Martha sat in a chair, surrounded by Michael and a few close friends. Her gaze was distant, her hands trembling as she clutched a handkerchief. "How could this happen?" she kept repeating. "Who could want to harm George?" Michael tried to comfort his mother, but his mind was already racing with thoughts of possible reasons for what had happened. He knew his father had enemies, but he had never thought someone would go this far. Richard nervously paced around the room, glancing at his watch and the entrance door. His behavior did not escape the attentive gaze of Detective Harris. Half an hour later, the investigative team arrived at the restaurant. The crime scene was cordoned off, and a thorough collection of evidence began. Forensic experts in white suits carefully packed George's glass for further analysis. Detective Harris approached Michael and quietly said, "Michael, I know this isn't the best time, but we need to talk. All signs point to this being deliberate poisoning." Michael nodded, feeling a chill run down his spine. "I understand, Robert. We are ready to cooperate in any way we can." While the police worked at the crime scene, a desperate battle for George Anderson's life was underway at the hospital. His condition remained critical, and the doctors were doing everything possible to save him. The golden wedding anniversary, which was supposed to be a celebration of love and family unity, had turned into the beginning of a dark story filled with secrets and suspicions. Detective Robert Harris stood in the middle of the restaurant hall, observing the work of the forensic team. His experienced eyes took in every detail. The arrangement of the tables, the half-finished drinks, and the tense faces of the guests. The arriving police officers had cordoned off the area, preventing anyone from leaving the scene. "Johnson," Harris called to a young officer, "make sure all the guests stay to give their statements. No one leaves without being questioned." Harris approached the table where George Anderson had been sitting. The forensic team was just finishing up their examination of the glass from which the guest of honor had drunk. "What do we have?" the detective asked the head of the forensic team. "Preliminary analysis indicates the presence of an unknown substance in the drink residue," the expert replied. "A more detailed analysis in the lab will be required, but I'm almost certain we're dealing with poison." Harris nodded. His suspicions were confirmed. "How soon can we get the results?" "Given the urgency of the case, I'll request the lab to expedite the process. We should have preliminary results in 12 to 14 hours. The detective turned toward where Martha Anderson sat, surrounded by her sons. He knew the upcoming conversation would be difficult but necessary for the investigation. "Mrs. Anderson," Harris began gently as he approached the family, "I understand you're in shock right now, but I need to ask you a few questions." Martha looked up at him with tear-filled eyes. "Robert, how could this happen? Who could wish George harm?" "That's what we're trying to find out," the detective replied. "Did you notice anything unusual before George gave his toast?" Martha shook her head. "No, everything seemed normal. George was in a great mood, talking about our life, about the children." "And who poured the champagne into George's glass?" Harris asked. I'm not sure," Martha answered, frowning. "I think it was a waiter, but I wasn't paying attention." Michael joined the conversation. "Detective Harris, do you think this was deliberate poisoning?" Harris looked intently at Michael. "At this point, we're considering all possibilities." "Michael, did you notice anything unusual in your father's behavior recently? Did he mention any problems or threats?" Michael shook his head. "No, nothing like that. Dad was entirely focused on preparing for the anniversary." Richard, who had been silent until now, suddenly spoke up. "What if it was an accident? Maybe someone just mixed up the glasses." Harris turned to the youngest Anderson son. "That's one of the theories we're investigating." "Richard, could you tell me where you were just before the toast?" Richard visibly tensed. I was at the bar helping with the drinks." "Were you personally pouring champagne for anyone?" the detective clarified. "No, that was done by the waiters," Richard replied quickly. Harris made a mental note of Richard's nervousness. It could be due to the shock of the incident, but it could also indicate something more serious. At that moment, one of the officers approached the detective. "Sir, we've completed the preliminary questioning of the guests. Most of them say they didn't notice anything suspicious." "Thank you. Keep working." Harris nodded and turned back to the Anderson family. "We'll keep you informed about the investigation. Please don't leave the city without notifying the police." Leaving the restaurant, Detective Harris headed to the hospital where George Anderson was. In the reception area, he was met by Elizabeth. "How is he?" Harris asked. Elizabeth shook her head. "His condition is critical. The doctors are fighting for his life, but they're not giving any guarantees." "I'm sorry to hear that," the detective said sincerely. "Elizabeth, do you have any idea who might want to harm your father?" Elizabeth paused for a moment, thinking. "You know, detective, my father always seemed like an exemplary family man and a respected member of the community. But lately, I noticed he was often worried about something." "What exactly?" Harris asked, interested. "He didn't say directly, but I felt something was troubling him. It might be related to his past work as a lawyer." Harris made a note in his notebook. "Thank you, Elizabeth. This could be important to the investigation." As he left the hospital, Detective Harris felt that this case would not be an easy one. Behind the facade of the perfect Anderson family, there were secrets he needed to uncover. The next morning, Harris gathered his team at the police station. Photos of the Anderson family members and a diagram of their relationships were pinned to the board. "So, what do we have so far?" he asked his colleagues. The lab confirmed the presence of poison in George Anderson's glass. One of the detectives reported, "It's a rare plant-based toxin that is hard to detect in a standard test." "That means the poisoning was deliberate," Harris concluded. "Someone planned this carefully." "We have information on the family's financial situation," another officer continued. "On the surface, everything looks fine, but we found some unusual transactions on Richard Anderson's accounts." Harris frowned. "Look into that more closely. We also need to dig deeper into George Anderson's past as a lawyer. The answer might lie there." The investigation was gaining momentum, and Detective Harris felt this case could turn out to be one of the most challenging of his career. Detective Harris sat in his office, reviewing the Anderson case files. Photos from the crime scene, forensic reports, and notes from interrogations lay scattered across his desk. He felt that the key to solving the case was close, but he couldn't yet grasp the thread that would tie everything together. There was a knock on the door. "Come in," Harris said, not taking his eyes off the documents. His assistant, Detective Sarah Chin, entered the office. "Boss, we have new information on the Anderson case." Harris looked up. "What do you have, Sarah?" "We conducted a deeper investigation into the family's finances. At first glance, everything seemed fine, but when we dug deeper," Sarah placed a new folder of documents on the desk. Harris opened the folder and began flipping through the contents. His eyebrows raised in surprise. "Is this certain?" "Yes, boss. It seems that George Anderson had been living a double life in recent years. He had a secret offshore account into which large sums of money were regularly deposited." Harris thoughtfully rubbed his chin. "Interesting. And what about the other family members?" "Here's where it gets interesting," Sarah continued. "Michael Anderson, the eldest son, apparently knew about his father's secret dealings. We found evidence of several transfers from George's offshore account to Michael's personal account." "And Richard? What about his debts?" Harris asked. "Richard is indeed drowning in debt, mostly from casinos and loan sharks. But here's the strange part. All his debts were paid off with a large transfer a week before the incident. The source of the transfer is still unknown." Harris stood up and walked over to the board with photos of the Anderson family. "What about Elizabeth and Martha?" "Elizabeth doesn't appear to be involved in the family's financial dealings. She genuinely works at a prestigious clinic and has a stable income. As for Martha, we found something unexpected." Harris turned to Sarah. "I'm listening." "A month before the incident, Martha suddenly withdrew a large amount of cash from her personal account. We haven't yet been able to trace where that money went." Harris nodded thoughtfully. "Good work, Sarah. This changes a lot. We need to re-interview all family members. And yes, find out how George Anderson is doing. If he's regained consciousness, we need to talk to him." Sarah nodded and left the office. Harris returned to his desk and began going through the new documents. The picture of the crime was becoming more complicated. The next day, Harris called Michael Anderson in for questioning. Michael looked tired and tense when he entered the interrogation room. "Mr. Anderson, thank you for coming," Harris began. "We have new questions regarding your family's financial situation." Michael visibly tensed. "I don't understand how that relates to my father's poisoning." "It might be directly related," Harris replied. "Mr. Anderson, are you aware of your father's secret offshore account?" Michael turned pale. I don't know what you're talking about." "Really? Then how do you explain the transfers from that account to your personal account?" Harris placed a bank statement in front of Michael. Michael stared at the document for a long time, then sighed. "All right. Yes, I knew about the account. My father, he used it for some questionable deals." "What kind of deals?" Harris asked. "I don't know all the details. My father said it was related to his past work as a lawyer. Some old cases that came back to haunt him." Harris watched Michael closely. "And you didn't think to report this earlier?" I was trying to protect the family. I thought I could help my father resolve these issues quietly." "And your brother and sister? Did they know about this?" Michael shook his head. "No, as far as I know. Richard was too caught up in his own problems, and Elizabeth. She was always distant from the family's affairs. Harris made a note in his notebook. Mr. Anderson, you understand that withholding information could be considered obstruction of justice. Michael lowered his head. I understand. I'm ready to cooperate fully. I never thought it would go this far. After questioning Michael, Harris called Richard in for a conversation. The youngest Anderson son looked nervous and avoided direct eye contact with the detective. Richard, tell me about your financial problems, Harris began. Richard shifted uneasily in his chair. What problems? Everything's fine with me. Really? What about your casino debts that were suddenly paid off a week before your father's incident? Richard turned pale. I don't know what you're talking about. Richard, it's best to tell the truth. Where did the money to pay off your debts come from? Richard remained silent for a long time, then quietly said, It was Mom. She gave me the money to pay off my debts. Harris raised an eyebrow in surprise. Your mother? And where did she get that amount of money? I don't know, Richard nearly shouted. She just gave me the money and told me not to tell anyone. She said it was for the sake of the family. Harris looked at Richard thoughtfully. And you didn't ask where she got the money? No, I was just so relieved to be rid of the debts. I didn't think. Yes, it seems you really didn't think, Harris remarked. All right, thank you for the information, Richard. We'll talk again. After the interviews, Harris returned to his office. The picture of the crime was becoming increasingly tangled. Every member of the Anderson family seemed to have their own secrets and motives. But who among them could have committed the poisoning? And was George Anderson really the intended target, or was it a mistake? Harris glanced at the clock. He still had one more important conversation to have with Martha Anderson. He felt that this conversation might be the key to uncovering the mystery that shrouded the Anderson family. Detective Harris arrived at the hospital where George Anderson was still being treated. The patient's condition remained critical but stable. Outside the room, Harris met Martha, who looked exhausted from sleepless nights. Mrs. Anderson, I need to ask you a few questions. The detective began gently. Martha nodded, and they stepped aside from the hospital room. Mrs. Anderson, we've learned about a large sum of money that you withdrew from your account shortly before the incident. Can you explain what the money was for? Martha visibly tensed. I don't understand what this has to do with what happened to George. It could have everything to do with it, Harris replied, especially since this money was used to pay off your younger son's debts. Martha's eyes widened in surprise. How did Richard tell you? Harris nodded. Mrs. Anderson, it's very important that you are honest with us right now. Where did you get such a large sum? Martha was silent for a long time, then sighed heavily. It was my life savings. I had been setting aside a little each month for a rainy day. George, he didn't know about this money. And you decided to give all your savings to pay off Richard's debts? You don't understand. Martha shook her head. Richard was being threatened. The people he owed. They aren't the kind who wait long. I was afraid for his life. Harris looked closely at Martha. Mrs. Anderson, were you aware of your husband's secret financial dealings? Martha looked at the detective, surprised. What are you talking about? About hidden accounts, suspicious deals. Your eldest son, Michael, was aware of them. No, I knew nothing about that. Martha seemed genuinely shocked. George. He always said all our finances were transparent. At that moment, an alarm sounded from George's room. Nurses and doctors rushed inside. Martha watched in horror. What happened? What's wrong with him? She screamed. Harris led Martha away as the medical staff worked in the room. After a few minutes, which felt like an eternity, a doctor came out of the room. Mrs. Anderson, he began. Your husband suffered a cardiac arrest. We were able to revive him, but his condition is extremely unstable. Martha burst into tears, and Harris held her to keep her from collapsing. Doctor, the detective addressed the doctor. Could this have been caused by the poisoning? The doctor pondered. Possibly. But it could also be a reaction to the treatment. We are still fighting against the unknown toxin in his system. Harris nodded and turned to Martha. Mrs. Anderson, I'm very sorry, but I need to ask a few more questions. This could be important for the investigation and for your husband's treatment. Martha, still crying, nodded. Do you know if your husband had any enemies? Anyone who might have wished him harm? Martha shook her head. No. I didn't think so. But now, after what you've told me about his secret dealings, I don't know. It's like I didn't know the man I lived with for 50 years. Harris made a note in his notebook. And what about your children? How were their relationships with their father recently? Michael was always close to his father. They often discussed work, business. Elizabeth was busy with her career but also maintained a good relationship. But Richard? Martha hesitated. What about Richard? Harris gently prompted. They had a complicated relationship. George was disappointed with how Richard was managing his life. There were arguments, especially when Richard's debts came to light. Harris nodded. Thank you for your honesty, Mrs. Anderson. One more question. Did you notice anything unusual in the behavior of any family member before the incident at the celebration? Martha thought for a moment. Now that you mention it, Elizabeth seemed unusually nervous. She kept checking her phone, as if she was waiting for some important message. This information piqued Harris's interest. Until now, Elizabeth had seemed the least involved in the family's secrets. Leaving the hospital, Detective Harris headed back to the office. New theories and questions were swirling in his mind. He felt he was close to a breakthrough, but a crucial detail still eluded him. At the office, Sarah was waiting for him with new information. Boss, we checked the calls and messages of all the Anderson family members over the past month, and we found something interesting on Elizabeth's phone. Detective Harris carefully studied the printouts of Elizabeth Anderson's phone calls and messages provided by Sarah. His gaze settled on a series of calls from an unknown number that had increased in frequency in the week leading up to the incident. Sarah, did you find out who this number belongs to? Harris asked. Yes, boss. The number is registered to a James Hawthorne. And here's the interesting part. This Hawthorne was a client of George Anderson 15 years ago. Anderson defended him in a financial fraud case. Harris thoughtfully rubbed his chin. And what was the outcome of that case? Hawthorne was found guilty and served 10 years. He was released about 5 years ago. Interesting. What about the content of the messages? Sarah shook her head. Most of the messages are encrypted. We're working on decrypting them, but it will take time. Harris nodded. All right, keep working on that. Meanwhile, I think I'll pay a visit to Ms. Elizabeth Anderson. An hour later, Detective Harris sat across from Elizabeth in the interrogation room. The woman looked tense but tried to remain calm. Ms. Anderson, thank you for coming, Harris began. We have new questions about the events leading up to the incident involving your father. Elizabeth nodded. I'm willing to help the investigation in any way I can. Tell me, are you familiar with the name James Hawthorne? Elizabeth noticeably tensed. I'm not sure. Maybe I heard the name from my father, but I can't recall the context. Harris placed the call printouts in front of her. How do you explain the numerous calls and messages from Mr. Hawthorne to your phone over the past month? Elizabeth turned pale. I can't explain that. Ms. Anderson, withholding information could seriously harm you. I strongly recommend being honest. Elizabeth was silent for a long time, then took a deep breath. All right, James Hawthorne contacted me about a month ago. He said he had information about my father that could destroy our family. What kind of information? He claimed that my father was not just his defense attorney, that they were partners in illegal financial schemes, and that he had proof. Harris listened closely. And what did you do with this information? At first, I didn't believe him, but Hawthorne was persistent. He threatened to reveal everything if I didn't help him meet my father at the golden wedding celebration. And you agreed? Elizabeth nodded, tears streaming down her face. I thought I could control the situation. I thought my father could explain everything. I didn't know. I didn't know that Hawthorne planned to poison him. Harris frowned. Did you know about the poisoning in advance? No, Elizabeth exclaimed. I swear, I didn't know. I thought Hawthorne just wanted to talk to my father. By the time I realized what had happened, it was too late. Why didn't you go to the police right after the incident? Elizabeth lowered her head. I was scared. I thought I'd be accused of being an accomplice. I didn't know what to do. Harris tapped his fingers thoughtfully on the table. Ms. Anderson, you understand that your actions could be considered aiding and abetting a crime? Elizabeth nodded without raising her eyes. I understand. I'm prepared to face the consequences. But please find Hawthorne. He's the real criminal. Harris stood up. We will find him. In the meantime, I'm placing you under arrest for further investigation. After Elizabeth's arrest, Harris called an emergency meeting with his team. We have a name and a motive, he began. Now our main task is to find James Hawthorne. The search for Hawthorne took 3 days. He was found in a small motel on the outskirts of town, preparing to flee. When apprehended, he had documents that confirmed George Anderson's involvement in financial fraud 15 years ago. During the interrogation, Hawthorne confessed to poisoning George Anderson. He betrayed me, Hawthorne said, used me as a pawn in his games, then left me to rot in prison. I just wanted justice. Justice is not poisoning a man in front of his family, Harris replied firmly. George Anderson survived but was left paralyzed. The trial of James Hawthorne was swift. He was sentenced to life in prison for attempted murder and other crimes. Elizabeth Anderson received a suspended sentence for withholding information about the planned crime. Michael and Richard avoided criminal charges, but the family's reputation was irreparably damaged. Martha Anderson filed for divorce, unable to forgive her husband for the years of lies and crimes that led to the tragedy. Closing the case, Detective Harris reflected on how the desire for revenge and years of hidden grievances could destroy even the most seemingly prosperous family. This case served as a reminder to him that behind the facade of respectability, dark secrets often lurk, capable of destroying many lives in an instant. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories that are coming out every day.